This time on the hit list, 9 music legends who were never destined to grow old gracefully. This is the Fender Stratocaster that guitar hero Jimi Hendrix famously set on fire on stage at the 1968 Miami Pop Festival. Nearly 40 years later, it fetched a staggering £300,000 at a London auction.
Only the Beatles excel in price over Jimi Hendrix. There's a hierarchy. It's the Beatles, Hendrix, Elvis, then Rolling Stones, Madonna and stuff like that. It levels out into various areas. But Jimi Hendrix is one of the most collectible people, rock stars. Not just because he's dead, but because his career was so short.
After growing up in poverty in post-war Seattle, James Marshall Hendrix didn't get his hands on a guitar until he was 15 years old. At the age of 27, on September the 18th, 1970, he was found dead on the floor of a London apartment after choking on his own vomit. In between, he transformed the electric guitar into a virtuoso instrument, paving the way for the guitar gods of heavy metal. To this day, he remains at number 1 on Rolling Stone magazine's list of greatest guitarists of all time. Audio engineer Eddie Kramer first worked with the Jimi Hendrix Experience after they formed in 1966.
I have to say this, that working with Jimi Hendrix was the greatest experience of my life, and no pun intended with the word experience, but he was just so wonderful in the studio. He had a great sense of humor. He had complete command of the instrument itself.
3 years later, with his new band Gypsy Sun and Rainbows, he was headlining the legendary Woodstock Festival in upstate New York. Due to delays and technical problems, the band didn't make it on stage until the Monday morning, by which time half the crowd had left.
Well, it certainly was a challenge. I've always said this about Woodstock, 3 days of drugs and hell.
At the end of the 2-hour set, Jimmy launched into a solo improvised version of the Star-Spangled Banner, which is now regarded as a special symbol of the late 60s.
It's really Jimmy, and it's incendiary performance. And you think about the political atmosphere at that time in 1969. We're in the middle of the Vietnam War, and he does this absolutely stunning performance of the Star-Spangled Banner, which kind of sums it all up, and that's the iconic performance.
Just like Jimi Hendrix, Nirvana frontman Kurt Cobain would not live to see his 28th birthday.
For the first time since the death of Jimi Hendrix in 1970, a major rock star has died at the peak of his creativity, and it could be said that his best work was still to come.
After years of struggling with drug addiction and the media pressures surrounding him and his wife Courtney Love, his death in 1994 was ruled the result of a self-inflicted shotgun wound to the head. Although Nick Broomfield may have had other ideas when he set about making his 1998 documentary Kurt and Courtney. However, his attempts to expose the demons of the singer-songwriter who led the grunge revolution in Seattle fell on fallow ground after Courtney refused to talk to him.
I assumed that, I didn't realize when I went in that Courtney Love won't talk about this aspect of her life. She won't talk about her relationship with Kurt Cobain, and in fact, I think currently isn't doing any interviews at all, precisely because she doesn't want to be asked any questions about his death or any things, I had no idea of that going in. In fact, I thought I would be making probably a rather likable and charismatic portrait of her.
Instead, the film detailed Kurt's unhappy youth in the logging town of Aberdeen in Washington and the devastating effect of his parents' divorce. As a teenager, he found solace in the local punk music scene and became a devoted fan of the sludge metal band The Melvins. After playing in a band called Fecal Matter, he teamed up with bass player Chris Novoselic and went on to form Nirvana with drummer Chad Channing, who was later replaced by Dave Grohl. Dave joined in the lead up to the release of their second album, Nevermind, which, with its lead single, Smells Like Teen Spirit, propelled Nirvana into the mainstream. Kurt found himself landed with the label of spokesman of a generation, a responsibility he neither looked for nor felt comfortable with. After Courtney gave birth to their daughter Frances Bean, attention centered on the couple's drug-taking. In March 1994, Kurt ran away from rehab in California and flew back to Seattle. On April the 8th, he was found dead by an electrician at his Lake Washington home, next to a suicide note that said, "I haven't felt the excitement of listening to as well as creating music, along with really writing, for too many years now." The coroner's report declared his body had been lying there for 3 days. Legend has it that although Mark Bolan was obsessed with cars, he never learned to drive because of his fear of an early death. Ironically, on the night of the 16th of September 1977, it was his position in the passenger seat of his purple Mini that ensured the fulfillment of his fatal premonition. The driver of the car, his girlfriend Gloria Jones, ended up surviving the collision with a sycamore tree in Barnes in southwest London. Had they been travelling in Mark's other car, his famous white Rolls-Royce, he would have undoubtedly walked away, but the car had been lent to rock band Hawkwind for the night. As Gloria lay recovering from her injuries, the media were all over the crash site, which has since become a shrine to the T-Rex singer who spearheaded the glam rock era in the early 70s and pumped out hits like Jeepster and Telegram Sam. Looters on the hunt for souvenirs also broke into his house less than a mile away in East Sheen. Among the mourners at his funeral in Golders Green were fellow glam rockers David Bowie and Rod Stewart. A wreath in the shape of a swan was displayed outside the service to commemorate his breakthrough single, Ride a White Swan. As well as his musical legacy, which has spawned T-Rex covers by the likes of Elton John, Duran Duran, Bauhaus and Adam Ant, Mark's flamboyantly androgynous sense of style has seen him live on in fashion trends and exhibitions.
Clearly you see people like Mark Bolan wearing the sailor suit in you actually see him in the exhibition in his Top of the Pops video. And that's kind of the sailor style lending itself to the flamboyance of glam rock.
The re-release of 20th Century Boy in 1991, after it was featured in a Levi's ad starring Brad Pitt, introduced a whole new generation to his music. And T-Rex songs have continued to turn up on countless film soundtracks, like Billy Elliot, Moulin Rouge, Meet the Fockers, and Quentin Tarantino's Death Proof. Like many of his 70s contemporaries, Mark has also been kept alive via the lucrative business of buying and selling pop and rock memorabilia. When it comes to talk of legacies, one dead legend stands head and shoulders above the rest in terms of lasting impact. More than 30 years after Elvis Presley passed away on the bathroom floor of his Graceland home in Tennessee, he continues to top the Forbes annual list of top-earning dead celebrities. As well as releasing more than 50 albums and starring in more than 30 movies, his early renditions of songs by Afro-American blues musicians paved the way for black artists in the 50s to be accepted in the mainstream. His swiveling hips, smouldering looks and sultry singing style raised the hackles of the post-war conservative establishment and wreaked havoc on audiences, with hysterical girls regularly needing to be conveyed from concerts to hospital by ambulance. Throughout the 60s and 70s, after a stint in the army, his addiction to various prescription drugs, hefty weight gain and penchant for jumpsuits saw him becoming a figure of ridicule in some circles. But the shine never faded from his later performances in Las Vegas.
Yeah, I think he just had amazing charisma, really, and a great performance, and you know, people recognized that and could feel his passion in what he did.
Despite his incredible public profile, Elvis remained a very private person, surrounding himself with a tight-knit entourage that included his younger stepbrother, D. Edward Stanley.
And he said, "Hey, David, forget school, go to work for me, drop out of school, go to work for me, and I'll take care of you."
Although Stanley had only been 4 when his mother married Elvis's father Vernon in 1960, he soon began to understand what the world saw in his big brother.
Now, I'm a Beatles, Stone, I'm a rock and roller, and here's my big brother, the king of rock and roll, and I began to realize that when I saw those shows, started touring with him, and watching others respond to him, not necessarily just an audience of fans, but other rock and rollers who would meet him and just, wow, this is the king.
And to the thousands of devotees who make pilgrimages to Graceland for the annual vigil on August the 16th, Elvis Aaron Presley will forever remain simply the king.
If Elvis Presley walked into this building today, I would feel the presence of him. I mean, that's how strong his presence was. And that's an unexplainable phenomenon that I think in 30 years from now, I'll be 80-something years old, and we may be still sitting in this room talking about why is Elvis Presley so big.
Ranked 28 on Rolling Stone magazine's list of the greatest singers of all time, rock and blues legend Janis Joplin was destined to die of a heroin overdose in a motel room in LA on the 4th of October 1970, 3 months before her 28th birthday. Parked outside was the famous psychedelic hand-painted Porsche, which went on display as part of a flower power exhibition at Whitney Museum in New York.
It was a friend of Janis Joplin's called Dave Richards, who also worked as a poster artist, who custom painted it for her. And I think and in a period when you probably saw more hand-painted cars than now, this is a particularly elaborate example of a customized psychedelic car. So that makes it special, apart from the fact that it was Janis Joplin's and she used to drive it.
Janis's lasting impression on the public psyche seems remarkable when you consider that she didn't even begin making it as a singer until June 1967, when her band Big Brother appeared at the Monterey Pop Festival. It was the song Piece of My Heart off the album Cheap Thrills that gave the band their breakthrough hit and prompted Time magazine to call Janis probably the most powerful singer to emerge from the white rock movement. The album sold 1 million copies in its first week. Janis's wild and raw vocal style had touched a nerve, and she and the band performed back-to-back tours across America. Janis left Big Brother and the holding company at the end of '68 and embarked on a solo career, claiming that fame hadn't changed her.
This whole thing that's happened to me, you see, this whole success thing, it hasn't yet really compromised the position that I took a long time ago in Texas. That was to be true to myself, to be the person that was on the inside of me.
Already deeply entrenched in her addiction to heroin, however, the person inside of Janis Joplin was clearly deeply troubled and haunted by demons from her unhappy childhood.
Janis Joplin is someone that you look at and you think, man, what could have been? You had this woman whose career just seemed unstoppable, and it was someone who you hadn't seen before. This was someone who wasn't traditionally pretty in a model vein. Many people thought she was tremendously sexy, but not in a way that you traditionally associated with singers at the time. She was a little bit messy, she was all over the place, but when she opened up her mouth, it was literally, you could hear her heart spill out.
The lead singer of The Doors met his death in a bathtub in a Paris apartment on July the 3rd, 1971, by a suspected heroin overdose. Like Janis Joplin, Jimi Hendrix and Kurt Cobain, he was just 27. The velvet-voiced singer and poet who turned leather trousers into an essential requirement of every rock star's wardrobe was not always the king of cool. This 1964 public relations film, shot at Florida State University, shows a rather nerdy-looking Jim, acting the part of a student whose application for university has been rejected.
But what happened? How come my parents or the state or the university didn't look ahead?
The college dork couldn't be further away from the long-haired, hard-drinking, swaggering, psychedelic lizard king he would go on to become. Reported to have an IQ of 150, he formed The Doors with Ray Manzarek, Johnny Densmore and Robbie Krieger in 1965. The breakthrough hit Break On Through to the Other Side was followed up by Light My Fire.
So Jim one day, we realized we didn't have enough songs, enough originals, so Jim says, why don't you guys write some too, you know? 'Cause I'm tired of doing this all myself. So I went home and I said, okay, in order to, you know, Jim's stuff is pretty heavy duty, right? So I said, in order to compete with his, I'll make it about earth, air, fire, or water, you know, the 4 elements. And I picked fire.
In between writing poetry and working on film projects, Jim released 5 albums with The Doors before his increasing dependence on drink and drugs forced him to take time out. But when he moved to Paris in 1971, his fellow band members had no idea they would never see him again.
He'd come here to Paris to get away from being a rock star, to become an artist again, to become the poet. And I was very excited about that. I thought, Jim Morrison's going to Paris, the city of artists, city of light.
Nearly 4 decades later, they remembered him in his heyday.
Well, he was an artist first and foremost. He was a poet. But as a human being, he was wonderful. He was very charming. Great personality, very funny, a great wit, a good man to be with, great deal of fun. And a good guy to have a beer with. He was you could spend a good evening in the pub with Jim Morrison, I'll tell you that.
His grave at Père Lachaise Cemetery in Paris has become a shrine to his memory, to which fans still flock to mark his birthday and the anniversary of his death.
I always felt lucky when I was with John Lennon. I always knew that that was special.
Photographer Bob Gruen is certainly not alone in his admiration of John Lennon, who was murdered in front of his apartment block in New York in 1980. In 2002, a poll conducted by the BBC put him 8th on a list of 100 greatest Britons. In partnership with fellow Liverpudlian Paul McCartney, he wrote some of the most popular and influential music in rock and roll history, for the group that remains at #1 on Rolling Stone's list of the Immortals, the 50 greatest artists of all time. During the height of Beatlemania, when their concerts were regularly drowned out by the din of women screaming, John got himself into trouble with the church for declaring that they were more popular than Jesus.
We meant more to kids than Jesus did, or religion at that time. I wasn't knocking it or putting it down, I was just saying it as a fact. And it is true, especially more for England than here. You know, I'm not saying that we're better or greater or comparing us with Jesus Christ as a person or God as a thing or whatever it is.
After 13 years of megastardom with the Beatles, he embarked on a successful solo career, and along with his artist wife Yoko Ono, became a bohemian champion of social causes. One of his first solo releases was the anti-war anthem, Give Peace a Chance. His friend Gail Renard was there the day he wrote it, during his famous bed-in with Yoko in Montreal.
And he was a genius. He was incredible. But my thoughts were, my goodness, I'm the first person to see a new John Lennon song. And it was very important for him to write a peace anthem.
After taking 4 years off to spend more time with Yoko and their son Sean in the late 70s, John returned to chart-topping and Grammy-winning form with his album Double Fantasy in 1980. On December the 1st, hours after declaring he could go anywhere in New York and feel safe, he was shot 4 times in the back by Mark Chapman, who had been stalking him for several months. He was dead on arrival at the Roosevelt Hospital at 11:07 p.m. He was just 40 years old. High in the Dry Harbour Mountains of Jamaica, in a little village called 9 Mile, lies the resting place of the Caribbean nation's unofficial favourite son, Robert Nesta Marley. Although he died in May 1981, villagers who claim to have grown up with the reggae legend continue to honour him.
Giving inspiration to many musicians, to many Rasta, and so forth. And Bob Marley is a legend.
I don't have words to really talk about Bob Marley for the good that he have done, whether here in Jamaica or anywhere in the world.
The young Bob Marley grew up in the countryside and city, absorbing both cultures. He popularised and helped develop a way of life that was uniquely Jamaican. From the music he played to the Rastafari religion, to the way he dressed and wore his hair. At the age of 12, he moved to one of Jamaica's poorest neighbourhoods, Trenchtown. Songs written here made him an international superstar and a prophet of the people. Visitors who braved the trip into the dangerous neighbourhood can see the cramped room where he slept and played music. He released his first album with the Wailers, Catch a Fire, in 1973. The follow-up album, Burnin', included the songs Get Up, Stand Up and I Shot the Sheriff, which became a hit for Eric Clapton and neatly boosted Bob's profile. He then based himself in London and turned out top-selling singles like Exodus, Waiting in Vain, One Love and Jammin'. He backed up the messages of peace in his lyrics with performances at political concerts and was once shot in the chest and arm for his trouble. His tragic death at the age of 36 came via a melanoma on his toe, which he refused to have amputated because of his religious beliefs. The cancer spread to his brain and lungs, and he died in a hospital in Florida, leaving behind his wife Rita and 12 children, as well as his rich legacy.
His music will be around forever. Mozart's music, Mozart's still influencing people. That was 400 years ago.
You can hear his music in anything today, you know. There's only 12 notes, 26 letters. Most of it's been done before, but he's an innovator, and we carry him with us all the time.
Not only was he a musician and a singer, he was a very brave man who took a stance and fought for the rights of people, for human beings, and that's what it's all about.
The most successful rock act in music history owes its genesis to the vision of a 20-year-old guitarist from Cheltenham called Brian Jones. In May 1962, he placed an ad in the Jazz News, inviting musicians to audition for a new R&B group that went on to become the Rolling Stones. Acting as their manager, he got them a gig at London's Marquee Club, and from there they took up a residency at the Crawdaddy Club in Richmond. By the middle of 1963, they had a record deal and rocketed to fame on the back of songs like I Wanna Be Your Man and Little Red Rooster. But it was their live performances that made the headlines. The suggestive lyrics and Mick Jagger's sexually charged gyrations sent women wild, and riots frequently broke out at gigs. Although Mick was the band's frontman, it was Brian who had always been considered the leader. Not only had he come up with the Rolling Stones name, he continued to be heavily involved in the direction of the band, alongside their official manager, Andrew Oldham. Rolling Stone magazine once wrote, "If Keith and Mick were the mind and body of the Stones, Brian was clearly the soul." However, as Mick and Keith Richards grew more confident in their own songwriting, the band moved away from its rhythm and blues roots into rock, and Brian was becoming more and more of an outsider. Photographer Jared Mankiewicz, who worked closely with the Stones from 1965 to 7, remembers a tricky shoot.
But Brian Jones was being quite difficult, sort of lurking in his collar, the collar of his big brown fur coat, hiding and burying himself in a newspaper that he'd brought with him. And I was really concerned that he was going to mess the pictures up.
By the age of 22, Brian had lost control of his personal life, having fathered 5 children by 5 different women. In 1967, he and his friend Prince Stanislas Klosowski were arrested for possessing drugs after a raid on Brian's flat. He was put on probation for 3 years and ordered to seek help. However, he continued to spiral downwards, and on the 9th of June 1969, he announced he was leaving the Stones. 3 weeks later, he was found dead at the bottom of a swimming pool at his home in Sussex, thus becoming the inaugural member of the 27 Club of popular musicians who've died at the age of 27.